Okay, I think we're ready to go. So welcome to everyone to the first Dean's Lecture at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education for 2 years. I think the last one was in February of 2020. So it's just one of the great joys in life to have people back live, face to face, and rebuilding our community, I think, from a sort of an interpersonal base. So really appreciate you being here, and it's a great night to be here, International Women's Day. And a marvellous speaker, and I'll talk about our guest soon. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Indigenous Australians present. So as I said before, it is fantastic to be here, and you're really very welcome. It's always been a tradition, certainly since I've been the Dean, that we have a drink before the event, and I can always tell by the quality of noise when people are interacting as to whether it's going to be a great night. So it certainly will be a great night. People are certainly energised and pleased to be here, and I think it's a great occasion for us all to celebrate. I don't know about the rest of you, but walking between here and the main campus of the university, the place is just alive, and it's something that I think we've all missed and suffered from over the last 2 years. So I'm not sure that we're in a post-COVID world at the moment, but I think we're heading that way, and the signs are terrific in terms of people being able to, as I said before, interact with each other and rebuild that community and be part of what the dynamic university that the University of Melbourne is. Because it's International Women's Day, I do want to just share one email with you that I received today from an emeritus professor who was the Deputy Dean before Janet, who's here tonight, Janet Clinton, the current Deputy Dean. I just wanted to share Helen Cale and the Youth Research Centre's work because it is quite pertinent to today. So I'll just read her email. Hello, Jim, Janet. It's International Women's Day today, obviously, and in the Youth Research Centre we have some good news to share about our international contribution. In association with International Women's Day, UNESCO will launch the Connect with Respect Toolkit and research report developed by Emeritus Professor Helen Cale and colleagues in the Youth Research Centre. A successful pilot with 92 schools across Zambia, Tanzania and Eswatini showed positive outcomes in relation to student knowledge, attitudes, behaviour, and additionally over 90% of the students found that the program had improved their relationship skills and recommended that all schools involved in this program. So those 3 countries will all adopt this, and it is a really big contribution to International Women's Day, and part of the reach I think that MGSE has and the work that we do that changes lives not just in Australia but in international communities and countries where our kind of research is probably not available to them within their own small territories. So I just want to acknowledge that as one part of what we've been doing, but something really worth talking about today. What I'd also like to mention before we get started is that our most recent strategic plan has been published on Friday, so we're 1 week into it and making great strides. But if anyone would like to have a look at the copy and see what it is that we've prioritised for the next 5 years, it's a really important time for us. We've been working assiduously on our previous plan, which was really about sustaining MGSE. So this is, as I said on Friday, this is, I feel a bit like Paul Keating after he won the one election that he won, when he stood up and said, this one brings home the bacon. So this one brings home the bacon. I'd also like to offer the apologies of the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Duncan Maskell, who really wanted to be here tonight, but has had some issues personally, and both a commitment and personal issues, as I said, and was unable to attend. But he certainly sends his best wishes, and we'll catch up with you afterwards, Marcia. So as I mentioned earlier, this lecture is in celebration of International Women's Day. The International Women's Day 2022 campaign theme is Break the Bias. Who better to talk about breaking the bias than our speaker tonight, Marcia Langton, and I welcome you here, Marcia, and thank you for making time. This is our second go at this. We tried to do it last year, but I think saving it until this point in our return to campus has worked out to be in our favour, so thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Marcia Langton AO to present to us tonight. Professor Langton is a descendant of the Yiman and Bidjara nations of Queensland. She is an anthropologist, geographer and public intellectual. Since 2000, she has held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Professor Langton has produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Aboriginal alcohol use and harms, family violence, Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, and Indigenous culture and art. She is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a Fellow of Trinity College, Melbourne, and an Honorary Fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Queensland and the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. In 1993, Professor Langton was awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in recognition of her work in anthropology and the advocacy of Aboriginal rights. In 2016, she was honoured as a University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and in 2017 was appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne, where she leads in specific areas of engagement, cultural collections, heritage issues, and development of Indigenous teaching and research activities across the university. That's a formal introduction. I want to add a little bit through the interaction that I've had with Marcia over the last 4 years and been involved in some of her work. And while we're not going to announce it tonight, both Marcia and myself and Melita Hogarth, who sends her apologies tonight, an Indigenous academic working at MGSC, between the three of us, we've got a major project that's going to engage us for many, many years with a huge philanthropic contribution to do some nation building, I think, to talk about Indigenous, not to talk about, to create Indigenous curricula for all 10,000 schools in Australia and all 38 education faculties across this nation. So I don't want to talk much more about that. It's too early to, but I just wanted to acknowledge that is a big deal. So in my interactions with Marcia, I've found her to be formidable. It's probably a bit of an understatement. She's unrelenting about what she believes in, and she's fought for some of these causes for most of her life. But most of all, I do want to say to you, Marcia, you're so compassionate and so passionate to go with it about making a difference right across education and across the country, both for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, to make sure that we create a better world and where we can focus on the things that matter and not disregard the history that doesn't seem to be prominent in our curriculum and across our understanding of Australia, that has been here and sort of 60,000 years of history that we just don't acknowledge, and that's part of our work in our new project that we're working on. What I love most about Marcia, though, is that she's generous and constantly working with people and making sure that people grow within her sphere, and I think that's been fantastic for Melita, who couldn't be here tonight, someone who is really benefiting from Marcia's mentorship and capacity to be able to improve lives across the education sector. Most of all, though, her leadership is empowering, and she empowers people all around her, and so as a result of her work, so many people get to make that difference. So I guess what I love most, though, is that she understands that education is a lever that will change the world. It won't change it now. We're not going to solve the Ukraine problem, but education will, in fact, make us think more in a focused way about the world ahead of us and solve some of these existential problems of climate change and other issues. So it is about making sure that education is all about equity. There are so many young people in Australia in remote and rural places that are just not getting the education that they need, and Marcia has devoted a lot of her life to making sure that we right some of those wrongs. So I guess without any further ado, Marcia, we are really thankful that you're here tonight. We appreciate the work you're doing, and we want to hear about, I think the most important part is that closing the gap, leadership, scholarship and Indigenous achievement. So I hand over to you, Marcia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. appreciate that very warm welcome. And by the end of my lecture, you'll see why we get along so well together. We almost think the same way. Thank you for having me here, and good evening all. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, respects to their elders past and present. I also hope that those destined to follow in the footsteps of these elders do so with wisdom and compassion. My lecture this evening is a reflection on how we at the University of Melbourne are closing the gap in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educational outcomes. I will present some recent data that reveal our outstanding successes in student recruitment to both undergraduate and postgraduate awards, and discuss the impacts of those efforts in developing Indigenous leaders across all disciplines and professions. But I should say first that I won't be able to cover everything that we do, so I'll talk about some of the highlights of our work. There's so much more that would be here till next week if I went through it all. How we have been able to achieve some success in Indigenous student outcomes will also be considered here. Let me begin by outlining our goals. Our overall goal is to improve our performance so that the University of Melbourne enrolment and completion data demonstrates that we are closing the gap in Indigenous higher education outcomes. We have a target to achieve an Indigenous student headcount here at our university of 1,000 by 2029. We've established this target for our undergraduate and student headcount because we believe it is our duty to have a clear goal that we can achieve. We also have targets for the undergraduate to graduate student ratio to be equal for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students by 2025, and the success ratios between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, the success ratios between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students at the undergraduate level and the graduate coursework level to be 1 or equal by 2025. We need to do much more to reach our target. The 2020 total of 444 Indigenous students, 235 of them undergraduate and 209 of them graduate students, will need to grow to 637 by 2024. We need to have an additional 329 undergraduate students and 308 graduate students in order for the university to be on track to meet the 2029 target of 1,000 Indigenous students. The advice from the wonderful staff in our Indigenous Strategy Unit in Chancellery is that if the university is to reach the headline target of 1,000 Indigenous students by 2029, there will need to be concerted effort to continuously improve the rate of growth in Indigenous student enrolments each year. Our excellent Indigenous award completion rates are the result of a unique approach to Indigenous student participation, retention and completion developed over many years. Our efforts in developing pipeline projects at the university and also with other universities, partners and sponsors are a significant part of our story. We have encouraged Indigenous secondary students to complete their education, to aspire to higher education and aspire to a tertiary or post-school education career, and also enrich the university experience for staff and students. This has involved so much more than offering a variety of scholarships and bursaries, as we have done for many years. Our student support unit, the Murray Barak Institute for Indigenous Development, has played a key role. In the academic sector, some of our faculties have led the development of pipeline projects, such as the Victorian Indigenous Engineering Winter School, the National Indigenous Business Summer School, and the Residential Indigenous Science Experience. These provide inspiring immersive experiences for Indigenous students from grade 9 to 11 from across the nation, most of whom arrive with no sense of the success that they could achieve, nor that their dreams could be realised. When they leave us at the end of their program, they are inspired to aim for the stars. We have had many from these courses return to us as undergraduates. We also attract Indigenous undergraduates through two unique programs of university study. The Bachelor of Arts Extended is a 4-year degree for Australian Indigenous students, which provides a pathway to careers that build on a strong arts background. It is for motivated and aspiring Indigenous students who have not obtained the results for direct entry into the Bachelor of Arts, and the program aims to build a strong foundation for success among a range of disciplines. The students in this program have access to a range of opportunities, including study abroad, scholarships and prizes, work integrated learning and internships, as well as career opportunities. The other program, the Bachelor of Science Extended, is a degree for talented Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who may not meet the regular Bachelor of Science entry requirements. This 4-year course is a first step towards a dream career in science or technology. Students have access to the full range of subject choices and opportunities within the Bachelor of Science, plus support and academic skills development to ensure their success in their degree in science, and they have the choice of more than 40 majors covering all fields of science. Their studies include practical workshops and tailored academic support that is only available in this program. During their first year of study, they have the option to live on campus in one of the university's residential colleges, and also later to opportunities that all students have, including study abroad, volunteering and leadership opportunities. These programs are supported by scholarships, including scholarships to cover residential college fees. The Bachelor of Science Extended is part of a broader Indigenous STEM education project managed by CSIRO in partnership with the BHP Foundation. For undergraduates who have completed the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, for undergraduates who have completed, the Melbourne Graduate School of Education provides postgraduate coursework in the Professional Certificate in Indigenous Research and the Graduate Certificate in Indigenous Research Leadership, while the Post Centre for Indigenous Health in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences provides the PhD familiarisation program and a fellowship program, and these have attracted outstanding people. Other initiatives include the Masters of Social Equity offered by the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity program, and a new initiative, Indigenous Knowledge postdoctoral programs, scholarships and fellowships offered by the Indigenous Knowledge Institute. And as I say, that's just a few of our programs. The enrichment of the Indigenous education experience at the University of Melbourne has come about through deep collaborations between faculties and our community, bringing about changes that incorporate Indigenous knowledge and address the underlying issues in Indigenous education disadvantage. The role of Indigenous knowledge in higher education has been realised in a number of ways at our university. My own contribution has been to establish the groundwork for two key initiatives in this regard. This has taken at least 2 decades, but it is here that at the University of Melbourne that my ideas have found fertile ground. Jim's already talked about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Curricular project. I started this about 8 years ago to address a profound gap in the Australian curriculum. Indigenous systems of knowledge and philosophies have been taught over millennia through experiences of living on country and understanding environmental, cultural, medicinal, lingual, musical and healing practices. Yet these are not consistently or adequately taught in schools. This is why this project was identified as a priority towards improving the education outcomes for all Australian children who deserve to know about the 65,000 years of Australian history and human culture. the implications for Indigenous students are just as significant. We cannot be what we cannot see. The education systems across Australia have a responsibility to ensure that Indigenous students enjoy recognition of the histories and cultures of their peoples at school, just as other Australians have their histories and cultures incorporated into curricula. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders want their young people to learn about their history in school, so they can be proud of where they came from. Elders and community members want Australian children, especially Indigenous children and young people, to know that culture and community is resilient and diverse. We also want non-Indigenous children to learn about our cultures, societies and histories, so that they go out into the world with a respect for the First Peoples of Australia and learn about everything we have achieved. Teachers and educators need to understand that a rounded education about Australian history, society and environments must include Indigenous knowledge systems. There are teachers scattered across our educational institutions and schools who have enriched their lives and the lives of their students by teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. And by doing so, they have shown respect for our peoples and demonstrated a positive representation of Aboriginality to the Indigenous students in their classrooms, who want to see themselves respectfully reflected in the school curriculum. Conversely, there is a pervasive viewpoint from certain educators that teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures in a cross-curriculum manner is optional. This is further compounded by the lack of reliable curriculum assessment methods, the absence of support from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural practitioners, and inaccessible online resources. The absence of these informing factors enables educators to choose to ignore this part of the curriculum. As a result, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Curricular project, developed over at least 8 years here at the University of Melbourne, with a team of experts made up of Indigenous knowledge holders and disciplinary experts, has been supported by a donor and will be delivered, as Jim said, into every state and territory of Australia through the Melbourne Graduate School of Education in partnership with my unit and the Indigenous Knowledge Institute. And of course, with Indigenous education leaders, state-based and national education systems, partnering universities and a range of community stakeholders. Over the last 8 years, we have developed curricular resources that incorporate Indigenous knowledge for years 3 to 10 across 7 learning areas of the Australian curriculum. So the learning areas of the Australian curriculum are English, mathematics, science, humanities and social sciences, the arts, technologies and health and physical education. And you'll see on our website that we've chosen 3 initial themes, very well developed now, and often used in these areas of Indigenous knowledge: astronomy, fire and water. These are designed to assist teachers in implementing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority from the Australian curriculum resources, and these resources are compatible with all state and territory curricula. And as Jim has already announced, we are delighted that this project will continue at the University of Melbourne and will be based here in this school. And I do acknowledge the hard work of Dean Professor Jim Waterston and Dr. Melita Hogarth and their leadership in achieving this outcome with the generous support of a donor who will be announced in due course. Australian universities have a responsibility to undertake a broad range of initiatives to improve higher education participation and success for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, communities, and to deepen Australia's understanding of Indigenous knowledge and cultures. We here at the university are working hard to systematically eliminate the cultural gap in Australia's education system by shifting the narrative and teaching Indigenous knowledge systems that reflect empowerment, respect and truth-telling, by using a practical and sustained approach to enable all students to gain a deeper understanding of the cultural richness that has been maintained for generations. Another important and recent initiative is the Indigenous Knowledge Institute. This multidisciplinary research institute, whose home is in the Faculty of Science, is a long-held dream of mine. I established a similar centre at the former Northern Territory University, now the Charles Darwin University, in 1995. The Centre for Indigenous Natural and Cultural Resource Management was a first in Australian higher education, in that it brought together Aboriginal cultural leaders as fellows of the university to work with their counterparts in the humanities and sciences to apply rigorous research and engagement practices to the task of assisting Aboriginal traditional owners to preserve their knowledge and cultural systems and, importantly, their environments. As I have explained, the University of Melbourne has a strong foundation in education and research that elevates Indigenous knowledge systems within the academy. The Indigenous Knowledge Institute is building on this foundation to foster partnerships and develop our Indigenous research profile across the university and beyond. And already we are having a global impact. The Institute was launched at the 19th Symposium on Indigenous Music and Dance in December 2020, following a commitment made by our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Duncan Maskell, at the Garma Festival in August 2019. It is one of 5 current Melbourne interdisciplinary research institutes, and these aim to promote research linkages and collaboration across the university and to play a lead role in articulating university research to external audiences. The role of our Institute of Indigenous Knowledge is to advance research and education in Indigenous knowledge systems, and it is committed to supporting interdisciplinary research using various funding schemes, including structures designed to support Indigenous PhD students, researchers and community members. It will build on the research and education activities already underway at the university and become a global leader in Indigenous knowledge, research and education. It will also build on the work of the Indigenous Hallmark Research Initiative, which ceased operation in 2019. Most importantly, the Institute staff collaborate with Indigenous knowledge holders that are guided by core principles to ensure ethical, respectful and responsible relationships are developed and honoured. Next, I turn to the data. That's the front page of the Indigenous Knowledge website. Do have a look. Let me emphasise the conclusions that must be drawn from the data collected in our Chancellery. We are steadily closing the gap in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educational outcomes, and we are leading in several key respects in the university sector. These are the outcomes many of us have strived for, and I know many of you will be as pleased as I am that our collective efforts have had these results. I'm very grateful to the Indigenous Strategy Unit staff in Chancellery for providing these data, especially to Margot Eden and David Semmons. So let me share some of it with you. The most recent advice from the unit on our Indigenous student success rates is very encouraging. So our total Indigenous student success rate and success rate at the undergraduate course level have followed a similar trend between 2015 and 2020, decreasing from 2015 to 2017 and then increasing to 2020. So, you know, there's a bit of a seesaw, but we have improved dramatically from 2017 to 2020. Success rate at the higher degree by coursework level fell over a similar period, but has also recovered in the last few years. Given the previous decline in success rates at undergraduate and postgrad coursework levels, which saw our university fall from having one of the best success rates in the country up until 2016 to being mid-table in 2018 and 2019, the recent increase in success rates are positive. The success rate for Indigenous students in OPG courses is also promising, increasing from 73% in 2016 to 93% in 2020. So actually, you know, chancelleries should be singing this from the rooftops. But they're rather staid. Total enrolments of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students have increased markedly since 2011, more than doubling from 177 in 2011 to 535 so far in 2021. The participation rate has increased in lockstep with changes in the enrolment figures and is now 1.2%, above the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Victorian population, currently at 0.9%, but below the proportion in the national population, currently 3.3%. We made great progress in the previous decade. Retention rates remain steady and very high. I would say the highest in the country. If we could have a look at other universities' data, I think we'd be able to say that. Except for those in 2020 when all students were impacted by the pandemic, with many delaying return to university studies. The overall retention rate for Indigenous students is strongly influenced by the Indigenous undergraduate retention rate, as the number of these students substantially outweighs that of other course levels. So changes in the retention rate for Indigenous undergraduates mirror those for Indigenous students overall. While some Indigenous students are not being retained, they are enrolling or staying on at the university in other courses, possibly using their earlier courses as a pathway into their degree of choice. In contrast to declines at other course levels in 2019-2020 because of the pandemic and other factors, the retention rate of Indigenous high degree by coursework students, Indigenous high degree by coursework students increased. This also correlates with an increase in the number of commencing Indigenous high degree by coursework students. There is some anecdotal evidence that employment opportunities in 2020 led more Indigenous students to choose further education. It was further reported by our Indigenous Strategy Unit that in the reporting period up until 2018, the substantial increase in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander enrolments in the university has been faster than the increase in enrolments in the group of 8 universities on average. So we recruited faster than the group of 8 as a statistical artefact, but I'm pretty sure that says we're the best again. In 2018, the university had the 4th highest enrolment headcount of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the group of 8, behind the University of Queensland, the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales in that order. Although the growth in enrolment numbers outstripped average growth in the GO8, participation rate trailed the GO8 average. However, this also is a statistical artefact due to our university having the 2nd highest domestic student population in the GO8. So again, I would say that the participation rate is very high in the group of 8. So most enrolments of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students at our university are in undergraduate degrees, and this is typical of a university. And our undergraduate enrolments of Indigenous students at the university have more than doubled since 2011, and the undergraduate participation rates have largely followed the changes in enrolment numbers. In other words, they're stable and they're very high. There's been a plateau in undergraduate commencements numbers in recent years. Obviously, the pandemic was the major factor contributing to that. And also because over half of the university's Indigenous students arrive from interstate, while about 3/4 of other domestic undergraduates are from the Melbourne metropolitan area. So with border closures, of course, it would have been impossible for them to get back here. At our university, this is the trend in Indigenous student enrolments by course level from 2015 to 2020. And as you can see, our numbers are higher than ever. I think you can see that with the exception of the access courses, where there's been a slight dip, and as I said, many of them went into other courses using these as a jumping off point, we're doing very well. So these are our success rates going up and also very high. So this is the data that I've used to say that we're doing best of all as compared with other universities. And there's a lot of statistical mucking around to get to these conclusions. It's not something that I'm good at. So our Indigenous higher degree by research student numbers have more than tripled from 16 in 2015 to 58 in 2020. Graduate candidates with an Indigenous research topic have almost doubled from 35 in 2015 to 68 in 2020. And this is why I say that it is probable that we lead the sector in Indigenous doctoral student enrolments in Australia. Our Indigenous doctoral students enrolled in 2020 and 2021 made up about 9.2% of all domestic doctoral students nationally. So we count Indigenous graduate students and graduate students with Indigenous thesis topics. And you can see we're improving the numbers dramatically. So our graduate students made up 1.58% of all of our doctoral students. So we're halfway to closing the gap, more than halfway to closing the gap. And way more than halfway to closing the gap in Victoria, but nationally, more than halfway. So this suggests we are doing much better than other universities in attracting and retaining Indigenous doctoral students. And the growth has only slowed marginally in 20 and 21, despite the coronavirus pandemic. Most or more than 40% of our Indigenous graduate students are enrolled at GO8 universities, and the University of Melbourne had more graduate students in 2018 than any other Group of 8 university. So these data reveal the progress we are making in closing the gap on an indicator that is rarely reported publicly. Yet is fundamental to the future of Indigenous Australia, building strong Indigenous leaders. Our continuing investment in developing and supporting Indigenous programs and initiatives was developed during the Melbourne model phase, and the idea of the double helix in education, which lent itself to the idea of two-way learning that intertwines Western and Indigenous knowledge in educating our students. These are shows the trend in Indigenous student enrolments in undergraduate and graduate across all categories of awards from 2015 to 2019. So you can see in relation to the total, the green line at the top, that we've gone from 275 in 2015 to 444 in 2020. And in fact, I heard the other day that it's much higher than that. It's above 450 and probably going to reach more than 500, as we did last year, in fact. So sometimes the data isn't quite up to date. Our Indigenous programs and initiatives were developed in collaboration with our traditional owners, both here in Victoria on our 9 campuses, and also with traditional owners from our community partnerships, and with elders and other Indigenous people. And this is detailed somewhat in our Reconciliation Action Plan 2018 to 2022. I want to look now at the success of our Indigenous academics at our university. Like all academics, our performance is assiduously assessed, and research outcomes and research income are the 2 main measures. Indigenous research outcomes at the University of Melbourne. While the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on the number of publications produced at the university, the numbers of publications by Indigenous researchers increased from 45 in 2019 to 61 in 2020. Indeed, publications by Indigenous researchers has increased each year since 2017. After rising to 207 publications in 2017, publications on Indigenous topics have fallen to 144 in 2020. Changes in field of research codes introduced in 2020, including a new Indigenous Studies code, has had a substantial impact on the classification of Indigenous research topics. Previously, medical research had been the most significant category of research on Indigenous topics, but it has now been overtaken because of this new classification by the new category of Indigenous Studies. Income for research on Indigenous topics grew by almost $3.5 million in 2020 compared to 2019, and income for Indigenous research topics over the period 2015 to 2020 has exceeded $100 million. So we more than pull our weight in the research fields. Research income awarded to projects with Indigenous chief investigators has increased every year since 2016, reaching $6.9 million in 2020. These are in the Tier 1 category, where it's like playing 2-up. In fact, it's actually, you'd have a better win at the Crown Casino, I think. The majority, or $5.3 million, of this income was awarded through Tier 1 or Australian Competitive Grants Register sources, such as the Australian Research Council, the National Health and Medical Research Council, and Medical Future Fund grants. The total amount of higher education research income for Indigenous research in 2020 was $16,541,000. As reported by our Indigenous Strategy Unit, the University of Melbourne typically performs well in, say, Tier 1, and that's competitive research grants, and Tier 2, other public sector. And this appears to follow through to research on Indigenous topics and Indigenous researchers. So our achievement of over $16 million in Tier 1 research outcome in 2020 was the highest achieved ever. And of course, you know, this is because I believe that because of the programs I've talked about and our approach, we've been able to attract wonderful Indigenous talent like Melita Hogarth and many others who are very dedicated and hardworking people. In reflecting on educational outcomes revealed in the University of Melbourne data, I sought to elicit a few observations from our success in enhancing Indigenous leadership, scholarship and achievements. When I was younger, those words, Aboriginal leadership, scholarship and achievement, would not have been stated together, and any attempt to do so would have been met with derision and contempt. I could tell you many stories. Views on these matters have changed radically and quickly, and I have observed those changes with interest. I want to give you another example of how Indigenous leadership is encouraged and shaped, and that is in the work led by Associate Professor Michelle Evans in our Faculty of Business and Economics on Indigenous leadership. On this matter, she is highly instructive. In her chapter with Deirdre Tedmanson, she observes, research into leadership has been dominated by Western ways of thinking and is deeply permeated with assumptions about what it is to be a leader and how leadership takes place. Her efforts during the last decade in her annual Marcia Indigenous Business Masterclass program at the Melbourne Business School has led to 8 graduating cohorts of Indigenous entrepreneurial leaders, many of whom have made distinctive contributions to Australian society. She has done so by including Indigenous leaders as guests in her faculty and using case studies based on real-world situations that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander business owners will face. She led the team that initiated the Dillandua Centre for Indigenous Business Leadership to pursue equity for Australia's First Nations people in the economic life of our country. This centre is a collaboration between the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics and the Melbourne Business School. One of the most fascinating books on leadership ever written is Machiavelli's The Prince. During one phase of his fascinating career, he was caught up in the political intrigues of the reign of the Medici family, and he offered advice on the strategic stances and ploys that a leader could employ to retain power and influence and undo his enemies. His literary legacy, while much debated, includes political analysis of the stratagems for warfare, conquest, diplomacy and other matters of state that remain a part of the conduct of affairs between nations today. Leaders like the Prince have advisors who support their position. In the modern world, especially the democratic world in which leaders are elected, those advisors are the apparatchiks of political parties or ministerial staff, or the financial advisors to the wealthy, and often they are highly successful entrepreneurs whose wealth allows them to buy expertise, research, decision-making tools, influence, and a seat at the table of power. Throughout its long history, our university has produced both princes and Machiavellis. The apparatus of personal leadership may be very different from that of the prince that Machiavelli wrote about, but some elements are very familiar. Power can be wielded by leaders to shape the political state, to further their personal power and wealth, or power can be exercised to pursue visionary goals, such as universal access to education and health services, or curricular frameworks befitting a modern democratic nation. As we see in current events in Europe, for a term before the last presidential election in the United States of America, in Brazil, and altogether in about 2/3 of the world's nation states, the leader as Prince or Machiavelli remains the predominant leadership style, and with disastrous consequences. In my younger years, I was inspired by leaders like Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, José Ramos Horta, and importantly here in Australia, Lowitja O'Donoghue. Their primary qualities and attributes were not shaped by philosophical treatises and managerial manuals, but forged in fire. Our university has stated goals about the attributes of the graduates we educate. It is my impression that these were drafted by committees and media consultants. But allow me to persist with them, or at least some of them. The University of Melbourne list of graduate attributes provides a vision of the future leaders we seek to produce and the educational experience that will enable them to, for instance, lead change for a sustainable future. Our degrees develop research and reasoning skills that equip graduates to be influential citizens with high leadership potential. These are in addition to the obvious goal to produce graduates who leave with in-depth knowledge of their specialist disciplines and skills in examining issues with multiple disciplinary perspectives. Melbourne graduates ought to be critical, creative thinkers with strong reasoning skills. They ought to be able to apply knowledge, information and research skills to complex problems in a range of contexts, and they ought to be effective oral and written communicators. Our role is to prepare graduates to be entrepreneurial and innovative thought leaders. Our Melbourne graduates are held to be those who bring research and inquiry skills to challenges in their workplaces and communities. They are held to be adept, lifelong learners who generate bold and novel ideas by critically evaluating alternative possibilities and viewpoints. And much of that is true, and I'm sure many of you know just such graduates, as I do. The list refers to well-rounded graduates who are academically outstanding, practically grounded and socially responsible, distinguished by their broad outlook and openness to different perspectives. There are one or two people who don't meet that one. Engage with national and global issues and are attuned to social and cultural diversity. They have high levels of self-awareness and value their personal integrity and well-being. Among the list of attributes, not all of which I mention here, is the attribute of caring for others and, as I said, being self-aware. To this list, I must add the attribute that would most help our students, I believe, an understanding of Indigenous cultures and knowledge. For Australian Indigenous people, leadership consists of some very different attributes and social contexts from the Western tropes of leadership. For those of us concerned with accelerating outcomes for Indigenous people in higher education, we are required to achieve progress in several key areas. Methodologies for accumulating knowledge of good practice in the Indigenous higher education sector. And from all that I know about Aboriginal culture, having grown up Aboriginal as I did, in Queensland, that is very much an Aboriginal way. The continued development and implementation of Indigenous higher education curricula in order to improve educational outcomes. Developing recruitment strategies and pathways for Indigenous students into, within and beyond education studies, strengthening networks for those working with Indigenous students at secondary schools, universities and residential colleges, strengthening Indigenous higher education initiatives in the academic disciplines in our Indigenous support unit, Barak, university colleges, schools and in our community partnerships, facilitating relationships between Indigenous communities and the University of Melbourne to improve collaboration, the sharing of best practice research and teaching. Now, I will acknowledge that most of that I've learnt from Trinity College with its Indigenous Higher Education Annual Conference and the great work that has gone into that. And I have adapted it slightly to meet some new challenges. So I want to acknowledge here that the Trinity College was the very first part of the university as an affiliate college to offer a scholarship to Aboriginal students, in fact 2 in the very first year, not long after I arrived here, and very quickly became the college for Aboriginal students, reaching at one point over 25% of its population Indigenous, and have produced some extraordinary graduates. In order for Australia's leading university to do all of these well, I believe that Indigenous knowledge and practices must be an essential element of our higher education curricula across all the disciplines. And as I say, one of the attributes that we expect of our graduates. This evening, I have shared with you our double-pronged efforts to both improve education outcomes and to recognise and incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our teaching, research and engagement. Tomorrow evening, I will speak at the launch of an important book that also achieves these goals in a unique way. Associate Professor Dwayne Hummaker's book, written with elders and entitled The First Astronomers, is the kind of text that I want to see in every faculty in our university. It will be launched at the Science Gallery tomorrow evening. We included Indigenous astronomy in our Indigenous curricular resources. The late David Moll-Jarley and his colleague Dr. Molnick wrote, "Everything under creation is represented in the soil and in the stars. Everything has two witnesses, one on earth and one in the sky." Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples use the stars to navigate across Australia, including following particular stars or developing star maps that correlate to landscape features. This means that cultural astronomers with specialised knowledge and skills have and continue to observe the sky at specific times and locations to navigate ancient routes, ensuring sustainability of people, culture and environment. Interestingly, there are some parallels between these routes and Australia's highways. Star maps are communicated from generation to generation through song series, sometimes called song lines, stories that travel over the landscape. So that was Dwayne's contribution to our curricular resources, citing the great elder David Moll-Jarley. We here at the University of Melbourne are creating star maps too, but we do so in our practice as academics, teachers and researchers. We create maps for our students to find their way to their goals. I have shared with you some of our successes and how we achieve them. I look forward to a continuing collaboration with the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and its leaders. Thank you all for listening to me.